In the southwestern corner of the Pacific Ocean, the Earth is far from quiet. Where the Pacific meets the Indian Ocean, massive movements of the Earth's crust over millions of years have thrown up volcanoes, many of which are still active. Their lava and the dust which they drop on all the islands round about make this a very fertile region. People have been able to flourish on these islands in enormous numbers. In this journey through Indonesia and the Philippines to Hong Kong and China, we shall see all the contrasts of the Orient, from silent islands in tranquil seas to the teeming cities which have grown up during 2,000 years of commerce. The whole area is filled with magic for the traveller from the West. But of all the names which conjure up the mystery of the Orient, Bali is the most evocative. In Denpasar, the capital, the horse-drawn cabs reflect one aspect of the Balinese way of life which the traveller will notice wherever he goes. A contented acceptance of the old way, Bali has a long history of independence from neighbouring Java, both politically and in religion and culture. Art is part of every child's heritage here. Not only wood carving, but dancing, painting and sculpture are taught from a very early age. Many children are expert artists long before they're old enough to go to school. The excellence of Balinese carvings has been recognized for centuries. The prevalence of art in Balinese life stems from the fertility of the volcanic soil, where they can grow 2 or 3 rice crops every year, and where the sea is generous with fish and the forest with fruits. People have the leisure to develop their arts. Balinese music and dancing is unique, arising from the island's mixed Hindu and Buddhist religion. Bali is known as Palu Dewata, the island of the gods, or sometimes as the islands of gods and demons from the ancient dance style called barang, which recalls local mythology. The more classical style, ligong, is performed by young girls after years of training in special schools. Although many of these dances and ceremonies are now put on specially for the tourists, who provide an important part of Bali's income, most of them have been part of normal daily life for centuries. The energetic clowning of some of the older spirit dances recalls the Buddhist element in the island's religion. Of Bali's 2.8 million inhabitants, only 1/10 live in Denpasar. The rest cultivate the fertile lowland plains of the south of the island, living in villages where work and social life are regulated by a council of all the married men, each with an equal vote. Traditionally, all the inhabitants of a village can claim descent from a single ancestor. About 60 miles along the chain of islands lies Komodo, the Dragon Island. It's small and volcanic, with just 500 inhabitants, their numbers strictly regulated by the Indonesian government. There is little to see there but parched, grassy hillsides and a rugged, rocky skyline, rising to 2,500 feet out of the sea. And yet, people from all over the world toil up the hills into the interior, and the island has been a national park since 1980. What draws Westerners to this insignificant little island is an animal which was first reported by a Dutch explorer in 1912. It's a monitor lizard, and about 2,000 of them live up in these hills, only occasionally making their way down to the sea to cool off during the dry season. There are monitor lizards all over the Pacific and down into Australia, but none of them are like this one. The Komodo dragon can grow to 13 feet long, and its favorite food is goats. It has an amazing turn of speed in the hunt. A single dragon can catch and kill a roe deer, leaping on it from ambush and tearing its throat out. Once, a German tourist got lost up here, separated from his tour party. Later, they found his camera, his spectacles, and one shoe. Nothing else. Komodo lies at the western end of the Savu Sea. The island of Savu itself is the most southern point of Indonesia. The Savanese traced their descent back to Java in the 14th century, when Hinduism was the main religion. They weave a unique style of cloth called ikat, which dates back to those days, colored with charcoal and plant sap. Most unexpectedly among these remote islands, they also have an equestrian tradition. Their miniature ponies are descended from working horses brought in by the early Portuguese and Dutch colonists. In most of the other islands, the ponies died out, but here the art of breeding and riding them carried on. The dances of Savu are also somewhat unexpected. Each dancer wears a pair of ankle rattles to give an inbuilt rhythm to their steps on the soft sand. Visitors often think that the islanders have dressed up especially to greet them, but the beautiful hand-woven cloth is their everyday wear. The north rim of the Savu Sea is formed by the island of Flores. The eastern tip of the island was named by the Portuguese the Cape of Flowers, and the name stuck. From the sea, the dark volcanic slopes look forbidding, but the waters surrounding them are full of fish, and inland, the soil is rich and life is easy. The port of Larantuka was one of the first Portuguese settlements in the region, from which Christianity gained a tenuous hold over eastern Indonesia. There is still a touch of Christian influence here, seen in the processions on Catholic holy days, but the bulk of the culture of Flores is solidly Indonesian. At the village of Liwaloba, on the slopes of the sacred volcano irian, the people practice ancestor worship, and the women perform graceful dances which owe nothing to the Portuguese explorers or their missionaries. The dances of the men are fierce and exuberant, recollections of a more warlike past. Among the spears and bows, some of the mock warriors carry cutlasses copied from those used by their Portuguese conquerors in the bad old days. The tradition of ikat weaving is very highly developed on Flores, with many variations from village to village. The process starts with carding and spinning the cotton, using a variety of methods, from the manual to the mechanical, to keep the weaver supplied with yarn. The Solar Straits off the eastern end of Flores is a corridor of volcanoes dominated by Tawatala, which is still active. The straits have a doleful place in the history of exploration. They were the escape route for the tattered survivors of Magellan's last expedition, after he'd been killed at Mactan in the Philippines in 1521. By sailing westwards and rounding the Cape of Good Hope, they became the first men to circumnavigate the globe. Tawatala watched them go. The Solar Straits lead to the Banda Sea, dotted with small coral or volcanic islands. The smaller islands in these waters are mostly uninhabited, though they're used as camps by tribes of nomadic fisherfolk who wander from one to the other following the best of the fishing. For the rest of the year, their huts and boathouses stand empty and unattended. Mitutan in the Banda Sea and Jabregan and Vermatan in the newest Lima Islands to the east are names known only to the sea nomads and to people who print very large-scale maps. They are the nearest thing left today to the desert islands in the great adventure stories such as Robinson Crusoe and Treasure Island. Protected by rocks which could tear the bottom out of any pirate schooner which came near, there are beaches which never feel a human footprint from one year's end to the next. The development of these islands was a bloody business. Among the most famous were the Banda Islands, once the only place where nutmeg was found. In 1609, the Dutch sent an admiral to capture them, but he was murdered by the islanders. 10 years later, another Dutch admiral came. He wiped out 2/3 of the population and shipped the rest to Java as slaves. He replaced them with workers from Timor and Papua. The fort which he built still looms over the little town of Bandanera. The battles for the Spice Islands continued for many years, though the pressure was eased when nutmeg was transplanted to other islands nearby and eventually all over the tropics. Now Banda is so completely at peace that one would be forgiven for thinking that it was asleep. The people are governed by a sultan, originally one of the 5 who ruled the archipelago. Now he is the only one left, and he looks after the affairs of what was once an important trading post, but is now little more than a large village. The people are of unusually mixed stock because of the slaughter of the 17th century and the subsequent immigration from other islands. But between them, they have developed a tradition of hospitality and a way of life which are distinctly Bandanese. On neighbouring islands, the traditions are different. Kasiyui, the largest of the Watubela group, sees so few visitors that their arrival can create panic. Most of the population retreats into the forest, leaving only a couple of guards to find out what the strangers might want. The island is densely vegetated and has very fertile volcanic soil. Kasiyui is one of the prime producers of spices in the area. This might explain why its people are so shy, lacking the spontaneous warmth of the other islanders round about. Historically, producing spices has been dangerous, making one's home a battleground for greedy foreigners. Much better to keep oneself to oneself and strangers at arm's length. The island's principal wealth is spices, but they dry coconuts here as well to make copra, once very valuable as a source of vegetable oil. Laid out on mats in the sun are the flower buds which will dry into the familiar dark brown cloves. And beside them the nutmegs, once considered by Europeans to be the second rarest spice in the world, outvalued only by each nut's red cloak of mace, known as the gold of the spice trade. Once the islanders accept that a visitor is harmless, they tend to become highly exuberant in their welcome, as if to make up for their earlier reticence. Gifts of spices may change hands at this point, where earlier it would have been impossible even to suggest buying the precious harvest. These small boys will inherit a very valuable island and a secure, if rather secluded, way of life, all because of the accident that people like the flavour of nutmeg and cloves. is the trading centre for the islands, the meeting place for coastal fishermen and farmers from the interior. The only item of trade which leaves the islands is pearls, both wild and cultivated, which are occasionally traded across the sea to Irian Jaya, the Indonesian part of New Guinea. The coastline is dark and forbidding, and behind it lies what many travellers call the last frontier. In the magnificent rainforest which clothes its slopes live people whose way of life is a relic of the Stone Age. One of their headquarters is in the Asmat swamps, in an area known to Europeans as Flamingo Bay. Near here, in 1961, Michael Rockefeller vanished after a rafting accident. Such is the mystery surrounding the Asmat people that sensationalists attributed his disappearance to cannibalism, though there is absolutely no evidence that this is what happened. However, on first meeting the Asmat people, one could be forgiven for thinking that they are indeed a warlike and even cannibalistic bunch. Daubed with white clay, chanting their war cries, they are a daunting sight. Fortunately, their intentions are nothing but friendly. This is their ceremonial welcome to all outsiders who can approach only by sea. Their villages are inaccessible by land. The Asmat swamp is about the same size as Belgium, tidal for over 60 miles inland. It's dotted with villages wherever the ground rises above high tide mark. But the principal town is Agats on the coast of Flamingo Bay. It's an international trading post where Chinese from Indonesia and Western New Guineans come to barter for timber and crocodile skins, as well as the celebrated wood carvings of the local tribes. Despite their forbidding appearance, the people are welcoming, like traders all over the world. However, like all the inhabitants of the Asmat swamp, they are warlike amongst themselves. Relics of their grisly tradition of headhunting hang in some of the huts. Those who ask are assured that the practice is at an end. In the old days, the man who took the head was bound to care for the family of its previous owner. It was a form of social bonding. They never hunted the heads of strangers. What was the point if they didn't know the family? The ancestor poles are erected regularly for festivals in which the tribesmen appease the mischievous spirits of the dead. More than one village is usually involved. In the old days, the battle was genuine and probably ended in the exchange of heads. Now it's ritualized, but still seen as very important for the continuing existence of the tribe. Some occasional trading partners of the Asmat people live away to the north among the Mapia Islands, which are tiny specks of land surrounded by an enormous reef. Here the Pacific lives up to its name, the peaceful ocean. In these sheltered waters, the people move from island to island, gathering coconuts to make copra, which is bought from them at a guaranteed price by the Indonesian government. The rest of the time, they fish or gather vegetables. The sense of drowsy indolence here is a complete contrast with the rousing lifestyle of the Asmat. It's not just battles which can disturb people's peace. Further west of the Irian Jaya, in the North Moluccas, lies another small island where the peace is regularly shattered by the rumblings of an active volcano. It's Gamalama, 5,500 feet high in the interior of Ternate Island. There are two other peaks there as well, but they've been dormant for many years. Ternate was a trading post for sea-going Arabs in the 12th century, long before the Portuguese arrived in the North Moluccas. Consequently, its population is 90% Muslim. This was once the center of a vast island sultanate, where to profess the Muslim faith was the only way to get on in the busy commerce of the time. It's still a busy commercial town, serving the outlying islands as a marketplace and a center of administration. The Muslim faith is evident in the uniform of ternate schoolgirls, though they do not share the veiled solemnity of their sisters in more orthodox countries. The economy is based on fishing, timber and spices. The vegetable market is for local consumption, but locally produced cloves are a valuable export item, used principally for flavouring cigarettes all over Indonesia. Nutmegs and mace too are highly profitable crops. For all of its importance in the region, Ternate strikes the visitor from the west as a sleepy and relaxing little town. Away to the north, the last site of Indonesia is the tiny atoll of Manuk, uninhabited now, but evidently once used as a trading outpost. Pieces of broken Ming china can be found on the beach, relics of the days when spices were smuggled and traded out of reach of the Sultan. Now its only visitors are passing fin whales. It's hard to believe that 300 years ago these deserted waters were the scene of international diplomatic intrigues as the Dutch vied with Spanish and Portuguese traders for control of the world's only supplies of nutmeg. In the 20th century, oil is the key to success. Come westward to Brunei. This tiny Islamic sultanate is an independent state in its own right. Its 220,000 inhabitants have the second highest per capita income in the world after Kuwait, and all because oil was discovered here in 1929. The busy harbour once controlled trade throughout Borneo and into the Philippines, in two ways, legitimately and through piracy. All that came to an end in the 19th century, when British influence swept through the region. Brunei was nearly swallowed up into Sarawak, but then they found the oil. Now even the poorest fisherman has a powerful motorboat and a ready market for the pick of his catch. There are no taxes. Medical care, schooling and pensions are free for all, and even buying a car is subsidized by the state. The Omar Ali Salfuddin Mosque was built in 1958 in memory of the present Sultan's father. It was designed by an Italian architect, and it's one of the most impressive buildings in the East. The ceremonial boat which sits in the artificial lagoon surrounding the mosque is used for state occasions and also for the annual Coran reading competition. The people of Brunei are among the friendliest and most contented in the world. That's hardly surprising. Returning from the bonanza of Brunei to our northward trip across the Pacific, we must cross the ocean border into the Philippines. Our first port of call, Zamboanga City, took its name from the Malay word Zambangan, the place of flowers. It's a very apt name. Fort Pillar was built in 1635 by the Spaniards. It has been occupied successively by passing armies. The Americans in 1898 and the Japanese during the Second World War. Now it's residential, the home of local families. The local market is an important destination for any visitor to a new city. It gives a clearer impression of the way of life of the inhabitants than any guidebook. Here in the southern Philippines, the impression is of an abundance of fruits and vegetables. Some of them common around the tropics, and others too fragile to travel far from their native soil. The cuisine is international, with influences from Malaya, Spain, China and the United States. But the Philippines are particularly famous for their fish. Beside the harbour, the fish market is a daily meeting place, where specialities such as lapu-lapu and labahita are expertly prepared by the fishermen under the eye of discerning clientele. The freshest fish in the market is gathered together to make sininggang, an aromatic fish stew, only remotely similar to the bouillabaisse of the Mediterranean. Many of the fishermen are members of the Bayao tribe, sea gypsies who ply the coasts, living on their boats and their wits. Rio Hondo is a small village near Fort Pillar, built over the water on stilts, where some of the gypsies have been persuaded to come ashore to settle. Among them live other minority tribespeople, such as the Samal, whose own villages are very similar to this settlement, and the Tausug, an Islamic tribe who pride themselves on being fierce warriors. In Rio Hondo, their differences are not forgotten, but absorbed into the colourful community of this border town between Indonesia and the Philippines. They're all completely at home on and in the water. The houses might look flimsy, but Zamboanga is outside the typhoon belt with no pronounced wet or dry season. Further north, the town of Dumaquete on Negros Island has its own fish market, including an interesting dried fish section, from which the local cooks make dishes which are quite unusual to the Western palate. Combined with fresh vegetables and a selection of local spices, the dried fish is a memorable part of any visit to Negros. The way of life among the southern Philippines is active and full of energy, in spite of the gentle climate, for the human inhabitants at least. The people are the product of successive waves of foreign migration. Malayan features mingle in the streets with Chinese almond eyes, and the skin tones range from a deep tan to the clear gold of the East-West mix, which is known here as mestizo. The newcomers from overseas brought more with them than their facial features. Filipinos are eager to adopt any aspect of a foreign culture which appeals to them. Their language includes American slang, and their religious observances derive from Spanish customs, just as their table boasts a selection of cuisines from all over the world. The traffic in the smaller towns is just as hectic as it is in the great cities like Manila, but with the motorcycle cab predominating in the noisy bustle. There's always something to catch the eye, whether it's a local beauty queen out shopping or the beauty of the local flora. It's the women who hold the purse strings in the Philippines, managing the family finances with a firm hand. However, the great national heroes were men. Jose Rizal and Andres Bonifacio are commemorated all over the islands. They were the inspiration and the founder, respectively, of the movement for Philippine independence from Spanish rule. The Spaniards were replaced by the Americans in 1898. But the islands did not achieve full independence until 1946, after remaining firmly on the side of the West throughout the Second World War. Now, as a young republic, the Philippines may be somewhat unsettled, but at least the Filipinos are their own masters. A very large part of this densely populated country is still unspoiled. On the island of Bohol, the Loe River flows past ancient Spanish settlements, and on through forests which are part who live along the banks. The forests are the source of the timber, which is an important export item, and the river is the highway by which it can be carried to the sea. The interior of Bohol is famous for a unique topographical feature, the Chocolate Hills. There is nowhere else like this in the whole world. They are made of limestone, laid down millions of years ago when this was the bottom of some forgotten sea. Geologists cannot agree on the method of erosion which molded them into this extraordinary shape. Rising 200 or 300 feet from the flat valley bottom, they defy explanation. Bohol was one of the first Spanish settlements in the Philippines, and the way of life of its people seems to have changed very little since the 16th century. The church at Baclion, built in 1595, is the oldest in the islands. The wide streets and orderly layout of the many small towns reflects the peace which is to be found on the smaller islands of the Philippines. The people here love flowers. surrounding their public buildings as well as their own homes with gardens full of orchids and bougainvillea. Between the towns, lush rice paddies await the harvest. The flat land among the chocolate hills is sheltered and fertile with an excellent water supply. Rice is an ideal crop in a country where there is no shortage of manpower. Every aspect of rice growing is better done by hand than by machine. Or by foot. This traditional method of threshing the rice is found all round the islands. It suits the leisurely pace of life here much better than more violent ways of removing the grains from the stalks. The grains are winnowed by being poured from one basket to another, allowing the wind to blow the chaff into a separate pile. Spit-roasted pigs are the traditional meat for feast days. They too are cooked in a way unchanged for centuries. From Bohol to Surigao is a short journey along the northern coast of the island of Mindanao. At dawn, it can be a memorable experience, gliding between the rugged, forest-clad volcanoes which gave birth to the archipelago millions of years ago. Seen from the sea, out of earshot of human voices, the dawn of each day among the islands is like the dawn of time. From this range, nothing seems to have changed here since the first coconut washed ashore to grow into the first beach coconut palm, long before people came along to plant the palms for their own use. Then, suddenly, another little waterfront comes into view. Surigao is a small provincial city, typical of many scattered among the islands. The main source of income from outside is catering for tourists, and the main source of the traders' stock is the sea surrounding the islands. They bring shells and coral from the Sulu Sea to sell to their visitors from colder and less colourful countries. Shell collectors come from all over the world to browse through the wide variety available in specialty shops in the Philippines. Here, closer to the source, the range may not be so wide, and every shell may not be a specimen piece. But the prices are good, and there's always the chance of coming across an unexpected rarity. The cities themselves are full of surprises, the legacy of a long history. Ancient churches built by the Spaniards look over gracious plazas from the days when space was not at a premium. Next door, a modern city hall underlines the fact that the islands are now no longer an outpost of someone else's empire. They are nevertheless an outpost of a kind, an outpost of good manners. On the silent beaches as well as in the bustling towns, the atmosphere lends itself to contemplation, a philosophical approach to life which comes from the Malay ancestry of the people. They find the straightforward approach of the Westerner somewhat shocking and very ill-mannered by their standards. Whatever the business in hand, the Filipino believes that the best approach to the heart of the matter is a roundabout way, which avoids the danger of hurt feelings or loss of face. From the oldest to the youngest, people rely on the help and support of their family and friends, rather than priding themselves on their self-reliance, as Westerners do. A debt of gratitude to a friend or relation is much more important here than a sense of civic duty to society at large. The shifting political scene in the Philippines has very few repercussions away from the large cities. Coasting along between the islands, past fishing villages and deserted shores, it's hard to accept that this is the same country as we've seen on the television news. These are quiet islands where local concerns predominate, and events at the centre are heard only faintly. The nearest we get to Manila, the greater the bustle in the towns. But even in the town of Iloilo on Panay Island, the third largest city in the Philippines, the prevailing air is one of gentleness rather than political tension. The Spanish colonial churches here are the most splendid in the islands, filled with the glory and grandeur of their time. They range in age from the 17th to the 19th century in a number of different architectural styles. One of Iloilo's claims to fame is the quality of its wood carving. There are two important local timbers, monkey pod and camagong. Monkey pod is the wood of the acacia tree with a particularly beautiful grain. Camagong is darker in colour and very hard, which makes it difficult to work and consequently expensive to buy. As well as wood carving, Panay Island is a centre for trade in a translucent and iridescent shell called capiz. In colonial times, it was used for window panes, but nowadays it is more often made into decorative lampshades or jewellery. Clamshells, smoother and flatter than those found further north, are used as the raw material for innumerable decorative knickknacks. The supply is free and abundant, waiting only for the creative craftsman and flair of the artist. The shells themselves, untouched, are things of beauty in their own right. The westernmost island of the Philippines is Palawan, the fifth largest of the group, but relatively unexplored until oil was found off its shores in 1976. It still has no roads to speak of. To the northeast is the Cuyo group, low-lying islands where the principal occupation is fishing. The air is rich with the tang of drying fish, gathered from the incredibly well-stocked reefs offshore. The Cuyos export huge quantities of fish to the larger islands. But this western part of the Philippines exported something more important in the distant past. There is now good archaeological evidence that this was the cradle of Philippine civilization. Old Stone Age remains found here predate the Aborigines, who passed this way during their long migration to Australia. Although the islanders make a good income from their fish trade, they and the Palawan between them supply 65% of the country's fish. They still live in the traditional way, in villages around the coast. There is a small town called Cuyo, which is the administrative centre. But people prefer to live in close touch with the sea and the land, not crowded together as they do elsewhere in the islands. One could go to town to buy a broom, but why waste the effort when all the materials for making one's own are close at hand? Although it seems timeless, the way of life of these small islands may well be coming to an end. The oil strike off Palawan led to extensive exploration of the region and the discovery of deposits of other valuable minerals, such as gold, silver, copper and manganese. The volcanic cliffs and the forested hills of the interior are a happy hunting ground for the geologists. The forests have long been a source of valuable timbers, including the group of species which are known as Philippine mahogany and sturdy benguet pine. But now attention is turning to the rocks beneath. The Philippines lie within the Circle of Fire, the name given to the volcanic belt which borders the Pacific Ocean. They experience 10 or more noticeable earthquakes a year, and there are a dozen active volcanoes in the group. Here, though, in the southwestern corner of the archipelago, the earth is more stable. The uplifted limestone of the Coran Islands contains volcanic intrusions which are particularly rich in valuable minerals. This is where the 20th century will finally make its mark on the ancient and peaceful islands. Geologists and surveyors are gathering to find ways of exploiting the resources. The changes which will inevitably result will do the islands a great deal of good in a material sense, but there will be losses, including the simplicity of their traditional way of life. This may be the last chance to see the islands as they have been for 2,000 years or more. A clue to what they might become lies to the westward, in the massive trading centre of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the last British-occupied corner of China, the final chapter of a colonial saga which began in 1841 and will end when the colony is handed back to mainland China in 1997. Aberdeen Harbour is one of the sights of Hong Kong, full of floating restaurants and surrounded by a palisade of high-rise office blocks. The ancient Chinese culture survives here, though it was attacked and weakened on the mainland by the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. The gardens are places of formal beauty, but to a devout Chinese, they are also the home of spirits, and thus sacred as well as beautiful. Change is coming to Hong Kong, but it will not be sudden. The agreement between Britain and China includes clauses which will theoretically allow Hong Kong to retain its present social, economic and legal systems for at least 50 years after the handover in 1997. In the back street markets, there is nothing money can't buy, and it will stay that way. The Hong Kong Chinese, all 6 million of them, will become citizens of the People's Republic in 1997, unless they have money to leave. About 10,000 a year are doing just that. The rest will stay to see what the future might bring. Their new fatherland waits, just a short junk ride over the sea. Mainland China contains within itself the biggest contrasts of all. Its society seems to Westerners almost medieval, following a way of life which has been unchanged for many centuries. At the same time, a massive wave of industrialization is sweeping across the country, lifting it into the 20th century. On the surface, the effect is hard to see. The economy is very largely agrarian, with the huge population dependent on the production of rice by organized communes, where people work now as they did 2,000 years ago. As we saw in the Philippines, rice must be planted and harvested by hand. For the first time, the authorities are beginning to encourage private enterprise, in the country as well as in the towns. Perhaps they got the idea from the success of Hong Kong. Out in the country, the modern industry and military might of China is all but invisible. However, behind the traditional life in the communes, there is a stirring of Western ideas. Change will not occur overnight, but it is on the way, as China opens up and turns to face the rest of the world. In the cities, where shoals of uniformed cyclists swarm through the streets, the contrast with life in the islands could hardly be more marked. Yet, looking at the faces in the crowd, one can sense that these too are individuals, for all the official policy of dedication to a strict communist line. Their lives may well be controlled in every outward aspect, but they retain the ancient sense of beauty and proportion which has been China's greatest gift to the world. It is significant that even the doctrinaire excesses of the Cultural Revolution did not cut down the magnolia trees or destroy the ancient Buddhist and Confucian shrines. Beside the official pomp and grandeur among the vast squares and overbearing monuments, the old China survives, at least in the hearts of its people. The Forbidden City is a reminder of past glories. For all the superficial contrast between the islands and the mainland, or the past and the present for that matter, there is very little essential difference between them. When the Great Wall was started in 215 BC, the islanders of Bali were living much as they do today. As the 20th century sweeps through the Orient, the changes it will bring will be on the surface, as in China, not in the hearts of the people.